They did not come with warships or weapons or ultimatums carved in fire across the sky. They came with contracts, 47 pages of dense legal language, translated into every human tongue simultaneously, delivered through every digital channel on Earth on the morning of March 14th, 2047. The document was titled the Galactic Commerce Integration Agreement, and it was, on its surface, an extraordinary offer. Access to interstellar trade networks spanning 900 star systems. Advanced medical technology that could extend human lifespan by 2 centuries. Energy systems that would end scarcity on Earth within a decade. Materials science so far beyond human capability that every engineering problem humanity had ever faced would dissolve like paper in rain. All of it, freely given, in exchange for one thing. Incorporation. Earth and all human-inhabited space would become a subsidiary of the Valith Combine, the largest corporate entity in the known galaxy, with operations on 412 worlds, and a market capitalization that made the entire gross domestic product of human civilization look like a rounding error. The Combine's representative, a being called Administrator, Prof, delivered the announcement with the smooth, practiced warmth of someone who had done this before. Many times, on many worlds, he stood in the General Assembly of the United Nations and smiled with teeth that were not quite the right shape and said, "This is not a negotiation. It is an orientation. You are joining something larger than yourselves. We are here to help you understand the benefits." 83 nations signed within 48 hours. They signed because the technology was real and the poverty was real and the diseases were real and the offer was extraordinary. They signed because Administrator Prothves had, in meetings before the public announcement, privately explained to each head of state what the alternative looked like. He had not threatened. He had simply shown them a brief, visual record of the last 3 worlds that had declined incorporation, not destroyed. Just quietly, efficiently, completely ruined. Their trade routes cut, their resources redirected, their populations left to manage without the infrastructure that galactic commerce had already, silently, made them dependent upon before the contract was ever offered. It took 3 years for those worlds to sign. In those 3 years, 2 billion people died from preventable causes. Administrator Prothves showed the human leaders these numbers with the tone of someone presenting a weather report. Not cruel. Just informational. The remaining 31 nations signed within the week. Earth was incorporated. Humanity was a subsidiary, and the Valith Combine began, with quiet efficiency, the process of optimizing its newest acquisition. If the cold reality of that word, incorporated, hit you the way it should, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a chapter of this story. Share this, because what comes next is what humanity is truly made of. Optimization looked different from what most humans had expected. There were no chains, no labor camps, no dramatic symbols of oppression that human history had taught people to recognize as conquest. There were quarterly performance reviews. There were efficiency targets and resource allocation matrices and human capital utilization assessments. There were new regulations, always presented as improvements, that systematically dismantled every structure through which humans had historically organized collective resistance. Labor unions were reclassified as inefficiency multipliers and dissolved. Political parties were restructured as consumer preference advisory boards with no binding authority. Educational curricula were optimized for combined workforce requirements, which meant deep specialization in narrow technical skills and a systematic removal of history, philosophy, and anything that might produce the kind of broad, questioning mind that asked uncomfortable questions about why things were the way they were. The technology that had been promised arrived. It was real. The medical advances were genuine. Human lifespan extended to 240 years within 3 decades of incorporation. Energy abundance was real. No one starved. No one died of preventable disease. The standard of material comfort rose to levels that would have seemed utopian to any human alive in 2047. And in exchange, humans worked. They worked in the Combine's extraction operations on 17 worlds in the solar neighborhood. They worked in its data processing facilities, its logistics networks, its manufacturing chains. They worked efficiently. Because the Combine's workforce management systems were very good at ensuring efficiency, and they were comfortable. Because the Combine had learned long ago that comfortable workers are more productive than miserable ones. They did not own what they made. They did not choose what they made. They did not set the terms of their work, or the conditions of their communities, or the education of their children, or the future of their world. They had comfort without agency, security without freedom, long lives without the right to decide what those lives were for. Most people adapted. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptable, and adaptation is not the same as defeat. But in the corners, in the gaps, in the spaces that the Combine's optimization algorithms had not fully mapped, something else was happening. Year 11 of incorporation. A logistics coordinator named Yara Novak was doing what her job required, auditing the efficiency of a supply chain for a Combine extraction facility on what had been the coast of Norway. She was 32 years old, 2 years into her Combine employment contract, and she had been doing her job with the kind of careful precision that had earned her 3 consecutive performance bonuses. She was also, with that same careful precision, mapping every gap in the Combine's surveillance infrastructure. Not because she had a plan, because she could not stop herself from noticing. That was Yara's particular gift and curse. She noticed things. She noticed that the Combine's monitoring systems had been designed by beings whose concept of privacy was fundamentally different from humanity's. Specifically, they monitored transactions, communications, and movement, but they did not monitor what people thought. They did not monitor what people said in physical proximity, in whispers. In the old human tradition of standing close to someone you trusted and speaking to quietly for any recording to catch, they had not thought to build surveillance for that, because in their experience, subjugated species communicated through networks that could be monitored. They had never incorporated a species that had spent millennia passing messages through eye, contact, and body language, and the shared understanding of people who had known each other since childhood. They had never incorporated humans. Yara made her first contact on a Tuesday. She waited until her colleague Marco Stein was refilling his coffee, standing with his back to the monitoring array, and she said to him, in a voice pitched below the threshold of any microphone the Combine had installed, while handing him a data tablet that displayed a routine logistics report, "I have been mapping the blind spots." Marco took the tablet. He looked at the logistics report. He said, just as quietly, "How many?" Yara said. "Enough to start." Marco did not respond immediately. He took his coffee back to his station. He reviewed the logistics report for 4 hours, and buried inside the report's error correction data, in a layer of the file format that the Combined systems never examined because it was, by design, meaningless noise, he found what Yara had actually written. A map, not of a supply chain, of every blind spot in the facility's surveillance network, annotated with timing windows, coverage gaps, and a single question at the bottom. The question was, who do you trust? Marco thought about it for 3 days. Then he wrote back. He listed 7 names. That was the beginning. If that quiet defiance in the middle of total surveillance gave you chills, hit that like button hard. Subscribe right now because this network is just getting started. Share this with everyone who needs to hear it. Year 19. The network Yara and Marco had built had a name they never spoke aloud. They called it the Mesh, and it existed in the spaces the Combine could not see, in whispers. In the margins of logistics reports, in the error correction layers of data files that billions of transactions moved through every day without any Combine system ever examining what might be hiding in the noise, in the physical gestures and behavioral codes that had evolved organically among the network's growing membership. A language of posture and timing and the particular way a person set down a coffee cup that could communicate more than a page of text to someone trained to read it. The Mesh numbered 412 people across 6 facilities. It was not yet doing anything except existing. Yara had learned, from reading history in the curriculum gaps, that the Combine's education system had not quite managed to close, that networks discovered before they were ready to act were simply destroyed. So the Mesh existed and gathered information and did nothing visible and waited. What it gathered was extraordinary, because 412 people in 6 facilities, all of them in logistics or data processing roles, had access between them to a picture of the Combine's operations that no single Combine administrator had. The Combine's structure, Yara realized as the data accumulated, was a hierarchy. This seemed obvious, but its implications were not obvious until you saw them fully. In a hierarchy, information flows upward in summarized form. Every level condenses what it passes to the level above. By the time operational data reached Administrator Prothav's level, it had been summarized so many times that the actual texture of what was happening on the ground was almost completely invisible. Prothavas did not know what was happening in his supply chains at the level of detail that Yara did. No Combine administrator did, because the Combine had been running efficient operations for so long, on so many worlds, that it had never needed to. Their operations had always run smoothly, because every species they had ever incorporated had either complied with optimization or been crushed before they could do anything else. The Combine did not know how to look for what the mesh was doing because the mesh was doing something the Combine had no category for. It was building knowledge from the bottom up, accumulating a picture of the entire operation from the inside, at the level of detail that only the people actually doing the work could see. And what that picture showed, once Yara had assembled enough of it to read, was something that would have alarmed Administrator Prothvas considerably if he had known it existed. The Combine's Earth operations had a single point of failure, not a dramatic one. Not a military vulnerability or a technological weakness, an administrative one. A supply chain dependency so deeply embedded in the optimization models that removing it would cascade into 17 different critical shortfalls simultaneously. The Combine had, in its drive for efficiency, optimized itself into a structure that required perfect conditions to function, and perfect conditions were not something Yara was planning to provide. Like this video, if you can see where Yara's mind is going, subscribe because the plan is coming together and you do not want to miss it. Share this story because it belongs to everyone. Year 31. The mesh had grown. 1,200 people. 22 facilities. 5 worlds. Because humans had been shipped off-world in large numbers for combined operations, and wherever they went, they brought the communication culture that the mesh had developed on Earth. The error correction layer technique, the physical language, the deep human art of trusting carefully and building slowly and never letting the shape of what you were doing become visible before it was ready. The mesh on the extraction world, designated HR-7 in the Combine's catalogs, but called Red Rock by every human who worked there, was led by a man named Domingo Vasquez. Domingo was a geological survey coordinator, 51 years old, who'd been on Red Rock for 11 years. He had built the Red Rock mesh cell independently, having intuited from watching human behavior patterns at his facility that something like what Yara had built on Earth must exist somewhere. When contact was established between Domingo and Yara, through a chain of intermediaries so carefully constructed that tracing it would have required months of analysis, even if you knew what you were looking for. The first thing Yara sent him was the picture, the full operational map, what the mesh knew about the Combine's structure from the inside. Domingo read it over 3 days. Then he sent back, "You have found the same things I found, and more." "What did you find?" Yara asked. Domingo sent 2 words. Their schedule. The Combine's extraction operations ran on a precise cycle tied to galactic market conditions. Domingo had access, through his survey work, to the logistics projections that governed that cycle. He had found, embedded in those projections, a window. Every 47 years. Galactic market conditions created a period of roughly 90 days during which the Combine's cash flow from Earth operations was maximally leveraged against its debt structure for expansion in another sector. During those 90 days, the Combine could not absorb a significant operational disruption on Earth without triggering a cascade failure in its expansion financing. The next window was in 16 years. Yara read this and sat with it for a long time. 16 years. The mesh needed 16 years. She wrote back one line, "Then we have 16 years to be ready." Year 41. The mesh now spanned 9 worlds and numbered over 20,000 people. But numbers were not what mattered. What mattered was what it knew and what it could do. Over 41 years of careful, patient accumulation, the mesh had assembled something unprecedented. A complete operational picture of the Valith. Combines Earth sector, every supply chain, every dependency, every critical node, every administrative blind spot, every timing window in every monitoring system. And it had assembled something else, a plan, Not a rebellion in any traditional sense, not a military operation, which would have been suicide. A corporate action, the most sophisticated, precisely targeted, multi-layered operational disruption ever designed, built by logistics coordinators and data processors and geological surveyors and maintenance technicians and cafeteria workers and janitorial staff. All the people the Combine's hierarchy had classified as low-value human capital because they worked with their hands and their attention on the physical details of making things run. All the people who actually knew how things ran. The plan had no single dramatic moment, no explosion, no declaration, no rallying cry broadcast across the stars. It had 1,247 coordinated actions, distributed across 9 worlds and 42 facilities, each one individually deniable as accident or equipment failure or human error, each one targeted at a specific node in the operational dependency map. All of them timed to execute within a 30-hour window during the financial pressure period that Domingo had identified. The cumulative effect of 1,247 simultaneous equipment failures, supply delays, data processing errors, and logistics misroutes would be an operational disruption equivalent to, by the Mesh's calculations, a complete shutdown of Earth sector operations for between 60 and 90 days. During the Combine's financial window, the disruption would not destroy the Combine. It would not free Earth. It would cause the Combine's expansion, financing to fail, triggering a debt crisis at the corporate level that would take years to resolve. During those years, Earth sector's operational autonomy would increase by necessity because the Combine would not have the administrative resources to manage it tightly while managing a debt crisis. And in that window of increased autonomy, the Mesh intended to do what 41 years of preparation had been building. Negotiate. Not from weakness, from the position of an entity that had just demonstrated, quietly and precisely, that it understood the Combine's operations better than the Combine did, that it could disrupt them with surgical accuracy, and that it was willing to do so again, at larger scale, at a time of its choosing. Unless the Combine was willing to discuss different terms for the relationship between the corporation and its human workforce. It was not freedom, not yet. It was leverage, and leverage was how you started a negotiation that actually produced outcomes. Hit that like button if this plan is hitting different from anything you expected. Subscribe right now, because we are 41 years in, and the operation is about to begin. Share this story because this is how the underdogs actually win. Year 47. The window opened on a Tuesday. No one outside the Mesh knew anything had happened until the second day. The first indications were small, a supply delivery that arrived 12 hours late at a processing facility on Earth, attributed to weather, a data processing error at a logistics hub on Red Rock, attributed to a software update, a maintenance issue at an extraction site on the world humans called Bluebell, attributed to equipment age. Small things, routine things. The kind of things that happened in large, complex operations every day. By the end of the first day, there had been 43 such events across 6 worlds. Each one logged, attributed to a mundane cause, filed. By the end of the second day, there had been 219 events. The Combine's automated monitoring systems began flagging anomalous incident rates. At 3 facilities, on the third day, there were 411 events. The monitoring systems escalated to human review. Combine Administrator reviewed the data and filed a report noting elevated incident rates in Earth sector operations. Attributed to, and the Administrator selected from a drop-down menu of standard causes because nothing in the data suggested anything else. Workforce fatigue and seasonal environmental factors. The report went into a queue. On the 4th day, there were 612 events. The supply chain dependency that Yara had identified 15 years earlier began to stress. On the 5th day, the cascade began. Not dramatically. Not visibly from outside, but inside the Combine's operational systems. The carefully constructed mathematical relationship between Earth sector output and the expansion financing package began to show numbers it was not supposed to show. By the 10th day, Combined financial analysts, 3-star systems away, were looking at numbers that did not make sense, given what their operational reports were showing, and asking questions that were going to take weeks to unravel. On the 14th day, Administrator Prothvaz received a briefing. He was told that Earth sector was experiencing elevated incident rates attributed to multiple concurrent environmental and workforce factors. He was told the disruption was manageable. He was told remediation was underway. He was told everything that a hierarchy optimized for efficiency told its topics, which was the summarized, contextualized, professionally smoothed version of reality. He was not told that 1,247 precisely targeted actions were still running on a coordinated schedule. He was not told because no one in his hierarchy knew, because no one in his hierarchy had ever thought to look for this, because this had never happened before. Anywhere. On any world, in the entire history of the Valith Combine. On the 22nd day, Yara Novak sent a message to Administrator Prothvaz through official channels. She identified herself as a senior logistics coordinator in Earth sector operations. She requested a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss operational efficiency improvements she had identified in her review of Earth sector processes. Prothvaz's office sent an automated response scheduling the meeting for 6 weeks later. Yara wrote back and suggested that 6 weeks might be longer than the administrator would prefer, given current conditions. She attached a single document. The document was a summary, not of what the mesh had done, of what the mesh could do. If the meeting did not happen within 72 hours, the meeting happened in 61. Like this video right now, because this is the moment. Subscribe because we are not done, and what comes next is what 47 years built toward. Share this everywhere because this is what patient, brilliant, relentless people can accomplish. Year 47. Day 6. Yara Novak sat across from Administrator Prothvaz in a conference room on the Combine's Earth administrative platform. She was 78 years old, biologically, though she looked 40 by the standards of a body that had benefited from Combine medical technology. She had spent 46 years building the mesh. She had never sat in a room with a Combine administrator before. She had never wanted to, until she was ready. Prothvaz was not the same administrator who had stood in the UN General Assembly 36 years earlier. That Prothvaz had retired. This one was younger, more technically sophisticated, and currently extremely unsettled by a document that had crossed his desk 61 hours ago showing him an operational analysis of Earth sector that was more detailed and more accurate than anything his own systems had ever produced. He sat across from this human woman who should have been a mid-level logistics coordinator and said, "What do you want?" Yara said. "I want to have the conversation that should have happened 36 years ago," Prothvaz said. "The integration agreement was legal and binding under galactic commerce law," Yara said. "I am not contesting its legality. I am contesting its terms," Prothvaz said. "You are not in a position to contest its terms," Yara said. "I am in the position of someone who just demonstrated, at scale, that I understand your operations better than you do. I am in the position of someone who can, at the time and scale of my choosing, create operational disruptions that cost you more money, more credibility, and more administrative difficulty than renegotiating the terms of a single sector agreement." She paused. "I am not your enemy, Administrator. I am your logistics coordinator, and I am telling you that the current arrangement is not efficient. It is leaving value on the table because it is not using your human workforce at full capacity. And the reason it is not using your human workforce at full capacity is that humans do not work at full capacity under conditions of total managed dependency. We work at full capacity when we have something at stake, when we have agency, when the outcome matters to us personally. I have spent 46 years working at full capacity for exactly nothing the Combine gave me. Imagine what I would have done if I had something to work toward." Prothvaz was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What exactly are you proposing?" Yara opened a document on the table between them. She said, "I am proposing a renegotiation of the labor terms governing human employees in Earth sector operations, including provisions for collective representation, profit participation, educational autonomy, and a phased transition to partial operational self-management over 20 years. In exchange, the mesh, which is what I represent, will provide the Combine with full access to the operational intelligence we have accumulated over 46 years, which is, I believe you now understand, more comprehensive than anything in your own systems." She paused. "We will also provide assurance that no further coordinated disruptions will occur while negotiations are in good faith progress." Prothvaz looked at the document. He looked at Yara. He said, "You built all of this in my own systems for 46 years. Without detection," Yara said. "We had good teachers." She thought of Marco and Domingo and the 400 people who had started with nothing but whispers and error correction data. She said, "We are a species that worked very well in the dark." Year 63. 16 years of negotiation. They had not been peaceful years. The Combine's legal apparatus was formidable, and there were factions within the Combine that had argued for simply cutting the nodes identified by the Mesh's document, replacing them, and disciplining the humans involved. Those factions had been countered by financial analysts who pointed out that the Mesh's demonstrated capability to disrupt operations in ways the Combine could not detect or prevent made that approach a significantly worse option than negotiating. The Mesh had continued to grow throughout the negotiations, quietly, maintaining the demonstrated capability that made the negotiation mean something. And Yara had been joined by negotiators from the off-world human communities, from Red Rock and Bluebell and the other worlds where humans worked, each of them bringing the same patient, precise understanding of operations that the Mesh had developed. The agreement they produced was not freedom. It was the most significant renegotiation of corporate labor terms in the Valith Combine's history. Collective representation with binding authority. Profit participation at 6% of Earth's sector net revenue. Educational autonomy, meaning humans chose what their children learned. Partial operational self-management of all Earth-based facilities within 15 years. And buried quietly in Section 43 of a document that Combined administrators assumed was a provision that Yara had insisted upon and fought for through 11 years of arguments. A recognition that Earth and all human-inhabited worlds retained inherent sovereignty that could not be permanently alienated by any corporate agreement, and that the integration agreement was a commercial relationship subject to renegotiation every 50 years rather than a permanent transfer of authority. It was not the end. It was the acknowledgement, in legally binding galactic commerce language, that there would be an end, that the relationship had a direction, that humans were not property. They were parties. And parties could, eventually, walk away if you just felt something shift in your chest, like this video with everything you have. Subscribe right now because the story goes much further and every year matters. Share this because the world needs this story. Year 140. 3 generations had been born into the renegotiated agreement. The Mesh had become something different from what it had been in Yara's time. It was no longer a covert network operating in surveillance blind spots. It was a recognized institution, the Human Operational Coordination Network, officially acknowledged by the Combine as a legitimate representative body for human workers, which meant it operated in the open, and operating in the open meant it could do things the old Mesh had never been able to do. It could educate openly. It could organize openly. It could build openly. And what it built, over 3 generations, was an industrial and technical capacity that Combine administrators watched with growing unease. The profit participation, at 6% of Earth sector revenue had, over 80 years, accumulated into an investment fund of staggering size, because Earth sector revenue was staggering. Humans were extraordinarily productive workers. Eat, turn it out, under conditions where they had something at stake. And they had spent 80 years investing 6% of that production into their own infrastructure. Schools that taught engineering and history and philosophy and logistics and law. Research institutions that worked on problems the Combine had never bothered with, because the Combine had no reason to solve them. Problems like how to build a supply chain that does not depend on any single corporate network. Like how to manufacture the components of interstellar transit systems from raw materials available in the solar system. Like how to design a communications infrastructure that cannot be cut by any external administrative action. Like, in short, how to be not to be independent yet. Not to challenge the Combine yet. To be ready when the 50-year renegotiation window opened. Year 190. The second renegotiation, it was nothing like the first. The first had been Yara sitting across from Prothvas, with 46 years of quiet work behind her, and her demonstrated capability for disruption as her leverage. The second was a negotiating team of 40 human lawyers, engineers, economists, and operational analysts, sitting across from a Combine delegation and presenting, in exhaustive detail, an economic and operational case for restructuring the human-sector relationship that the Combine could not dismiss because it had been built by people who understood the Combine's own systems at the level of those who ran them. The human team knew the Combine's numbers better than the Combine's own delegation. They knew because humans had been doing the Combine's Earth sector operations for 140 years. And the people who do the work always know the numbers better than the people who manage the work. The second agreement expanded profit participation to 11%. It granted full operational self-management of all Earth-based facilities. It granted the right to operate independent trade routes within the Combine's network. And it included a provision that the Combine's legal team spent 3 weeks arguing against before accepting it. The right to negotiate separate commercial agreements with non-Combine entities. The right to trade with others. The crack in the wall. Year 240. Humans were trading with 17 non-Combine entities. None of the trades were large. None were significant enough to trigger the Combine's contractual clauses around competitive conflict. But the relationships were real, and the routes were mapped, and the trust was being built. And every year, the number of entities that humans had independent commercial relationships with grew. Every year, the portion of human economic activity that flowed through channels the Combine did not control increased by a small, consistent, deliberate amount. The mesh, still operating under its official name but still thinking of itself by its old name and the culture that had grown up around it, was doing what it had always done, building in the spaces available, making the next space available. And in year 240, a young economist named Priya Vasquez, great-granddaughter of Domingo, published a paper that was read by every member of the coordination network and by analysts at the Combine who did not know whether to be alarmed or to dismiss it. The paper was titled, Threshold Conditions for Full Commercial Independence, and it laid out, in rigorous economic modeling, the exact conditions under which a human sector commercial entity could operate fully outside the Combine's network. Without triggering economic retaliation it could not withstand. The paper concluded that those conditions would be met in approximately 40 years. In year 280, like this video if you can see the endgame from here. Subscribe to this channel because we are building to something enormous. Share this with everyone you know because the next part is what all of this was always for. Year 280, the third renegotiation. Priya Vasquez led the human delegation. She was 63 years old, and she had spent her career not just modeling independence, but building it. Spending every year between the paper and the renegotiation working with every sector of human, economic and industrial life to ensure that when this moment came, the model would match the reality. It did. The human delegation sat across from the Combine's team and presented a notice. Not a proposal, a notice. The integration agreement's 50-year review clause had been exercised every 50 years, each time expanding human autonomy. After 233 years, the accumulated effect of those expansions had created a situation where, by the terms of the agreement itself, the natural endpoint of the renegotiation process had been reached. Human commercial and operational independence was now sufficient that continued classification as a Combine subsidiary was neither economically accurate nor contractually justified. The notice gave the Combine 6 months to acknowledge this reality and negotiate transition terms, or the coordination network would file a dissolution claim under Galactic Commerce Law, the law that Administrator Prothavas had cited, back in year 1, as the legal basis for Earth's incorporation. The same law contained provisions for dissolution of subsidiary relationships when the operational independence threshold had been exceeded. Humans had been incorporated under Galactic Commerce Law. They intended to be deincorporated under exactly the same law, using the Combine's own legal framework. The document that supported the claim ran to 40,000 pages. It had been prepared over 20 years by a team of 400 lawyers working with the same meticulous care that Yara Novak had brought to mapping. Surveillance, blind spots in a Norwegian supply chain facility. 250 years earlier, the Combine contested it. Of course, they did. They had legal teams that had contested dissolution claims before. On other worlds, from other species, they had won every one. But they had never faced a dissolution claim assembled by a species that had spent 233 years learning how to use the Combine's own systems better than the Combine did. The case proceeded through galactic commerce courts for 11 years. Humans won every procedural motion. The Combine's lawyers were excellent. The human lawyers were excellent, and they had 40,000 pages of meticulously documented operational, financial, and commercial evidence that the threshold conditions had been met. Evidence assembled by the people who had been doing the work, who always know the numbers best. Year 291. The Galactic Commerce Tribunal issued its ruling. Earth and all human-inhabited systems were formally deincorporated from the Valith Combine. The relationship was restructured as a commercial partnership between independent entities, equal parties. Not a subsidiary and its corporate parent. Not a workforce and its management. Two entities that had things to offer each other and could choose the terms. The morning the ruling was transmitted, Yara Novak's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Amara, who worked in exactly the same logistics coordination role her ancestor had held, sat in what had been a combine facility and was now a human-operated commercial hub, and she held the coffee cup exactly the way Yara had held a coffee cup 250 years earlier. Not as a signal, just as a person having her morning coffee in a facility she worked in, but she thought of Yara. She thought of the 46 years of whispers. She thought of the error correction layers, and the physical language and the patience that had built the foundation everyone since had stood on, and she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "We did it." Year 490, 199 years after 490 years after the contracts arrived. Earth was the center of an independent commercial network spanning 31 star systems and including commercial partnerships with 42 different civilizations, including, in one of history's more interesting developments, several combined successor entities that had found, after the dissolution ruling, that humans were actually excellent commercial partners. The mesh had become the coordination network, had become the human commercial authority, had become, simply, the institutional backbone of human civilization in the galaxy. Not a government, not a military, a network. Exactly what it had always been, built in the spaces available, making the next space available, passing the method forward to every generation. On the 490th anniversary, the Human Commercial Authority commissioned a memorial. Not a monument. A record, the complete documented history of the mesh, from Yara's first 20-word message in an error correction layer to the tribunal ruling and beyond. Every name, every action, every small, undramatic, precise contribution to the 400-year project, every person who had whispered in a blind spot, every person who had written in the margins of a logistics report, every person who had held their coffee cup at a particular angle to say to someone across a room, "I see what is happening and I am not going to stop." The records. Introduction, written by the authorities' director, read, "They did not free us with heroism. They freed us with attention, with patin, with the refusal to stop noticing, with the human insistence on finding each other in any darkness and building something in any silence, and continuing past any obstacle, as long as there is still a next step to take." They were logistics coordinators and data processors and geological surveyors, and cafeteria workers and lawyers and economists. And the children of all of these, they were ordinary people who decided that ordinary people, working together, paying attention, over enough time, could do anything. They were right. They always were. If this story moved you, like this video right now with everything you have, subscribe to this channel because you are part of this community, and this community is part of this story. Share this with every person you know, because this is what humanity looks like when it decides not to stop. The contracts arrived on a Tuesday. They said Earth was incorporated. They used the word as if it were final, as if it were permanent, as if human beings, given enough comfort and enough management and enough time, would simply stop being the thing they had always been. They were wrong about that. They'd always been wrong about that. You do not incorporate a species that built civilization in the dark. You do not manage into submission a species that learned to talk in the margins of documents no one was reading. You do not contain a species that whispers its plans in the spaces between surveillance and keeps going for 490 years. Because the alternative is to stop. Humans do not stop. Not ever. Not for any empire. Not for any contract. Not for any administrator who smiles with the wrong kind of teeth and says this is not a negotiation. Everything is a negotiation. And we have been preparing for this one since the first Tuesday. We are always preparing. We never stop. That is who we are. That is all we have ever been, and we are just getting started. But the story does not end with the tribunal ruling. No story built over 490 years ends cleanly with a single legal decision. Because freedom, real freedom, the kind that lasts, is not an event. It is a practice. And humanity had spent 490 years learning how to practice it. Year 290. 1 year after the transition was harder than anyone had fully modeled. Priya Vasquez had modeled the economics. She had modeled the trade routes, the supply chain restructuring, the financial independence thresholds. She had modeled almost everything. She had not fully modeled what it would feel like for people who had spent their entire lives inside a managed system to suddenly be responsible for managing themselves, because 3 generations had been born inside the renegotiated agreement. 3 generations who had grown up with more autonomy than their grandparents. Yes, more educational freedom, more operational self-management, more economic agency, but still inside a system that, at its foundation, someone else had built and someone else ultimately controlled. The transition exposed something uncomfortable, a gap between the institutions that had been built and the cultural confidence to fully inhabit them. The coordination network had excellent logistics capability, excellent legal expertise, excellent economic modeling. What it had less of was the institutional culture of final accountability, the knowledge in the bones of an organization that there was no one above you to catch the errors, that the decision made here, in this room, by these people, was the decision. Full stop. The first year was difficult. 3 major commercial agreements were negotiated poorly because the human teams kept waiting for a higher authority to ratify them. A habit so deeply built into 4 generations of organizational culture that people did not notice they were doing it. An infrastructure project on Red Rock ran 8 months over schedule because the decision-making structure had too many review layers. Each one designed for a world where Combine administrators might overturn the decision, even though there were no more Combine administrators. And in the outer human settlements, the smaller communities that had been part of the network, but had always operated at the edges of the mesh's reach, there were real shortfalls. Communities that had depended on Combine supply chains that were now restructuring, that needed support the new human commercial authority was still learning how to provide. It was not a crisis, but it was a test. And the way humanity passed that test said something important about what 490 years of mesh culture had actually built. When the shortfalls became apparent, the response was not top-down. There was no central authority that identified the problem and dispatched a solution. What happened was what had always happened in the mesh. The people closest to the problem saw it first, and they reached out to the people next to them. And those people reached out further. And within 6 weeks, without any central coordination, 17 different human communities had organized mutual support arrangements that addressed every shortfall. Not perfectly, not without friction or argument or the occasional spectacular logistical failure that had to be rebuilt from scratch, but addressed by people who had learned in 490 years of mesh culture that the person next to you is the resource, that the network is the infrastructure, that you build what you need from what you have, with who you are with. The Combine had never understood that about humans. It had never understood that the culture the mesh had built was not a resistance movement. It was a civilization that had been growing inside the corporate structure for 490 years, learning itself, finding its shape, discovering what it was and what it valued and how it wanted to operate. The Combine had provided the pressure that gave it form. The way a riverbed gives a river its direction without ever understanding that it is helping the river find the sea. Like this video, if that image of the river and the riverbed reached you, subscribe to this channel because this community is exactly the kind of network this story is about. Share this, because what comes next is the part that lasts. Year 310, 19 years after deincorporation. The Human Commercial Authority had found its footing. The awkward first years, the over-reviewed decisions, and the supply chain gaps, and the cultural adjustment to full accountability had produced something valuable. Scar tissue, the organizational kind. The kind that comes from making mistakes at a scale where they matter and learning from them in real time and building the institutional knowledge that only comes from having actually been responsible. The authority was now genuinely excellent at what it did. Not because it had copied any model, because it had built its own model from experience, from the specific accumulated wisdom of people who had spent 490 years learning how to work in the spaces available. And the model it had built was unlike anything else in the galaxy. Every major commercial civilization the Authority dealt with was hierarchical. The Combine was hierarchical. Every Combine successor entity was hierarchical. Every alien civilization that had built interstellar commerce had done it through some version of top-down structure. Because top-down structure was efficient. It was fast. It produced clear decisions and clear accountability and clear lines of authority. It was also, as the mesh had spent 490 years demonstrating, brittle. Efficient systems optimized for normal conditions fail catastrophically when conditions stop being normal, because they have no resilience built into their structure. They have optimized the resilience out in the drive for efficiency. The human commercial authority was not efficient in the way the Combine had been efficient. It was slower. Its decision-making was more distributed. It had more redundancy built into every system than any purely rational optimization would have chosen. But it was, in the word that Yara Novak had used in that first meeting with Prothvas. Resilient, it could absorb shocks that would have crippled a hierarchical structure, because its capability was distributed across the network, not concentrated in critical nodes that could be disrupted. And when galactic market conditions became abnormal, which they did, as they always do over centuries of interstellar commerce, the authorities not only survived while hierarchical structures struggled, it grew. Because the conditions that damaged efficient hierarchical systems created opportunities for a resilient networked system to fill the gaps. This was not something Priya Vasquez had fully modeled. It was something the mesh had built into human commercial culture without anyone deciding to build it. By practicing it for 490 years, year 351, a species called the Marath made contact with the human commercial authority. Not for trade. For advice. The Marath had been incorporated by a different corporate entity, a mid-tier conglomerate called the Dacian Group, 40 years earlier. They had signed their integration agreement under the same circumstances Earth had. They were intelligent, capable, and deeply unhappy. And they had heard, through the commercial networks, that humanity now operated through. The story of the mesh. The Marath ambassador who came to the authorities' main facility was a female named Teeth, and she sat across from the authorities' director, a man named Solomon Vasquez, great-great-grandson of Domingo, and she said, "We want to learn how you did it." Solomon said, "It is not a technique. It is a culture," Tithra said. "Then, teach us the culture." Solomon was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Yara had said to Prothvas 260 years earlier. He thought about the river and the riverbed. He said, "The first thing you need to understand is that we did not do it to the Combine. We did not defeat the Combine. We grew past Italiano. There is a difference," Tithra said. "Explain the difference," Solomon said. "If you do it to them, you are still defined by them. Your actions are reactions. Your structure is a response to their structure. You are still inside their frame. If you grow past them, you build something that exists on its own terms. Something that is about what you are and what you value and what you want to become. The Combine becomes irrelevant, not because you defeat it, but because you become something it cannot contain." He paused. That takes longer. It is harder to sustain, because there is no enemy to motivate it. You have to motivate it with the thing itself, with the actual value of building something worth building. But it lasts, and it produces something the other approach never does. A civilization, not just a victory. Tithra was quiet for a long time. Densa said 40 years is not enough time for that. Solomon said, "No, it is not." He paused, "But it is enough time to start. And a start that is real is worth more than a victory that is hollow." He stood up and said, "Let me show you what we built, not the result. The method, from the beginning." The Marath spent 3 years studying the mesh's history. Every document, every record. The full account from Yaris's first message to the tribunal ruling and beyond. And then, with the human commercial authority's support, not its control, but its support, they began to build their own version. Their own mesh, in the spaces their corporate overseers had not mapped. Because that was the other thing Solomon had told Tithra. And the thing the mesh's history made undeniable, the method was not a blueprint. It was a principle. The principle was, find the spaces available and build in them. Make the next space available. Pass the method forward. Every species that applied that principle would build something different, something shaped by who they were, something that was theirs. Hit that like button if you can see what humanity was becoming in the galaxy. Subscribe right now, because the last part of this story is the part that makes all 490 years mean something. Share this, because this is the story the galaxy needed someone to tell. Year 400. 109 years after 6 species were now operating independent commercial networks that had grown from machine-influenced foundations. None of them identical to the human model, all of them recognizably shaped by the same principle. The galaxy was changing, not through revolution, which is fast and loud and usually produces less than it promises, through the slow, deliberate, generational work of building structures that serve the people inside them. The Valith Combine still existed. It was smaller. It had lost 11 subsidiary incorporations in the past century, each one following some version of the dissolution process that humans had pioneered. Not all of them had used the legal route. Some had used other approaches. But all of them had been influenced, directly or indirectly, by what humanity had demonstrated. That it could be done, that the mechanism existed, that patience and precision and the refusal to stop were sufficient, over time, to move even the largest corporate structure in the known galaxy. The Combine's legal team had spent 60 years trying to close the dissolution loophole that humans had used. The loophole was structural. Galactic commerce law had been written on the assumption that subsidiary relationships were stable, that incorporated species would not develop sufficient independent commercial capability to meet the dissolution threshold. The assumption had been wrong. Not just for humans, for 6 species. The Combine had lobbied the Galactic Commerce Tribunal to rewrite the relevant sections. The tribunal had declined, because the human delegation, and the delegations of 4 other species, had presented a case, meticulously documented, and legally airtight, that removing the dissolution provisions would mean that incorporation was permanent and irrevocable, regardless of changed circumstances, which was not a commercial relationship. It was slavery. And the tribunal was not willing to put that word into galactic commerce law. Year 460, 30 years before the 490th anniversary. A young woman named Yara Novak VII, named by a family tradition maintained through every generation since the original, was working as a commercial route analyst for the Human Commercial Authority. She was 27 years old. She had grown up hearing the story of her ancestor, the way children grow up with practical family history, not as legend. As instruction, she had read every document in the Mesh archive. Yara the First's field notes, Marco's list of 7 names, Domingo's 2-word message, the 40,000-page dissolution filing, Solomon's conversation with Tithra. She had read all of it and thought about all of it and formed, over years, a view of what it meant, not as history, as method. She spent her days mapping trade pathways, identifying inefficiencies, finding better routes, building the infrastructure of commerce, one optimized pathway at a time. She was doing exactly what her ancestor had done, paying attention to the systems around her, noticing what could be improved, building in the spaces available. The difference was that she was doing it openly, in an institution that valued it, for a civilization built on the principle, and she understood, in a way that felt personal rather than historical, what the original Yara had understood, that the work was the same regardless of scale, that the principle held at the level of a single logistics report and at the level of a 490-year project to restructure a species. Relationship with the largest corporation in the galaxy. Find the spaces available. Building them make the next space available. Pass the method forward. She was passing it forward. Every analyst in every authority facility was passing it forward. Every teacher in every school the Profit Participation Fund had built was passing it forward. Every community that had organized mutual support after without waiting for central authority was passing it forward. The method was not in the archive. The archive was a record of the method. The method was in the culture, in the way humans organize themselves, in the instinct, 490 years old and still growing stronger, to find each other in the dark, to build in the silence, to notice what the system had not accounted for, to refuse to stop. Like this video because you have stayed through 490 years and you deserve to be here for the ending. Subscribe to this channel and carry this story forward with us. Share it with every person who has ever worked in the dark towards something they could not yet see. Year 490. The anniversary. Yara the Seventh was 30 years old. She stood in the same room where the original Yara had sat across from Prothavas, now preserved as a public space in the Commercial Authority's Earth Hub. The conference table. The chairs. The window looking out over a city that had been a Combine administrative platform and was now simply a city. Human. Alive. Building itself. She had been asked to speak at the anniversary commemoration. She had argued that other people were better speakers, more historically significant, more qualified. The authority's director had said, "You are Yara Novak. You are the person we want." She had said, "I am the 7th person with this name." He had said, "That is exactly the point." She stood at the front of a room full of people, human and otherwise, representatives from 6 machine-fluenced civilizations, from commercial partners across 31 systems, from communities on every human-inhabited world. She held a single sheet of paper. On it were the original words from Yara the First's first message. 20 words. I have been mapping the blind spots. Enough to start. Who do you trust? She read them aloud. Then she said, 490 years ago, a woman sent 20 words in an error correction layer and waited to see if anyone was listening. She did not know if anyone would answer. She did not know if it would matter. She had no guarantee that the network she was starting would survive a week, let alone 4 generations. She only knew that she had been paying attention, and what she had seen when she paid attention was a gap between what was and what could be, and that gap was asking to be filled. So she filled it with 20 words, and the person next to her filled the next gap, and the person next to them filled the one after that. For 490 years. Nobody planned 490 years. Nobody sat down in year 1 and drew a 409-year map. They wrote 20 words. Then the next 20, one step, then the next step. For as long as it took, and every generation gave what it had and passed the work to the next. And the next generation picked it up not because they were obligated to, but because when you grow up inside something built with that much care and that much patience and that much refusal to stop, you understand what you are part of. You understand that you are not just the product of it. You are the continuation of it. She paused. We are the continuation of it. Every person in this room, every civilization that looked at what humanity built and said, "We want to learn how." Every community that organized itself without waiting to be organized. Every analyst and coordinator and lawyer and economist and cafeteria worker who ever paid precise attention to the systems around them and asked, what could be built here? We are all Yara Novak. We are all Marco Stein. We are all Domingo. Sending 2 words across a chain of intermediaries so carefully constructed that tracing it would have taken months. Their schedule. We are all Priya. Building 40,000 pages of argument from the ground up, because the truth fully documented is the most powerful thing that exists. We are the method, not the archive. The living, breathing, daily practiced method. And the method does not end. It does not retire. It does not declare victory and stop. It looks at the next gap and fills it. It finds the next blind spot and maps it. It asks the next question the system has not accounted for and refuses to let the silence be the answer. That is who we are. That is all we have ever been. A species that pays attention. A species that builds in the spaces available. A species that finds each other in the dark and says, I have been mapping the blind spots. Enough to start. Who do you trust? She set down the paper. She looked out at the room, at human faces and non-human faces, and the faces of beings who had traveled from star systems she would never visit to be in this room on this day. She said, the contract said we were incorporated. They used the word as if it was permanent, as if human beings, given enough management and enough comfort and enough time, would simply become what someone else needed us to be. They were wrong. You cannot incorporate a species that builds civilization in the margins. You cannot manage into submission a species that speaks its plans in the spaces between surveillance and pass those plans to its children and its children's children, until the plans become the culture and the culture becomes the world. You cannot contain a species that has been doing this since before it had words, since the first human being noticed something in the world that was not right and said to the person beside them, "Do you see what I see?" And the person beside them said, "Yes. What do we do about it?" That is the whole story. That is all it has ever been. Two people in the dark asking each other the right question. And then the next two people, and the next. For as long as it takes. She smiled. And it always takes as long as it takes. And we are always willing to take that long. Because the alternative is to stop noticing. We do not stop noticing. Not ever. Not for any empire. Not for any contract. Not for any administrator who tells us that what is permanent. Nothing is permanent. Everything is a space waiting to be filled, and we are very, very good at filling spaces. She looked down at the paper one last time. I have been mapping the blind spots. Enough to start. Who do you trust? She looked back up. She said, "All of you. I trust all of you." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone began to applaud. And then the next person. And the next, until the sound was enormous and warm and continuous. The way things built over 490 years of patient work tend to feel when they finally, fully arrive. Please like this video right now if this story gave you something real. Subscribe to this channel and be part of the community that carries this method forward. Share this with every person you know who is working in the dark toward something they cannot yet see. Tell them, I have been mapping the blind spots. Enough to start. Who do you trust? Because the network is only as strong as the people willing to be in it. And you are one of those people. You always were. We are just getting started.